The sun had barely risen over the horizon when the first wave of Zorathian ships entered Earth's atmosphere, a fleet of sleek metallic behemoths that seemed to stretch endlessly across the sky. They appeared without warning, no distress signals, no negotiations, just sheer overwhelming force. The first signs of the invasion came as the ground trembled beneath military bases and civilians alike. No one knew how to react by the time Earth's leaders scrambled to respond. The aliens were already deploying their forces in waves, tearing through cities and military installations alike. There was no hope of winning a conventional battle against them. In the chaos, Sergeant Jack Harris stood in the middle of it all, his heart pounding as his unit of Marines took cover in a half-destroyed building. Somewhere on the outskirts of what used to be a military command center, their orders had been simple: hold the line no matter the cost. But they weren't facing just any enemy, they were facing something alien, something unlike anything they had ever encountered. Their weapons were useless, their tactics irrelevant against the unstoppable force that was the Zorathian army. Harris looked at his men, each one crouched low and prepared for the inevitable battle. None of them spoke, but the tension in the air was palpable. They all knew what was coming, a fight to the death with a species that didn't care about the rules of engagement. They didn't care about civilians or prisoners. They only cared about conquest, and they had come to Earth to claim it for themselves. The first shot rang out. A Zorathian skimmer floated silently overhead before firing a beam that cut through the building like a hot knife through butter. Harris reacted instinctively, grabbing his rifle and firing into the smoke that billowed from the hole left by the blast. He didn't know if he hit anything, but he couldn't afford to waste time wondering. They had to keep moving, or they'd all die right here. One of his men, Corporal Stevens, peeked around the corner of the wreckage only to be greeted by the screeching sound of a Zorathian plasma bolt hitting him square in the chest. Stevens didn't even have time to scream, his body collapsing in a heap of charred flesh and armor. Harris gritted his teeth, but didn't flinch. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back. "Move out," he shouted over the noise of incoming fire. "We need to draw them into the alleyways. We can't fight them on open ground." The Marines scrambled into action, knowing the odds were stacked against them, but unwilling to give up without a fight. Harris's plan was simple: use the environment to their advantage. They knew the city better than the aliens did, and if they could force them into the narrow alleyways, they might have a chance at slowing them down at least long enough to cause some damage. The next few hours were a blur of gunfire and explosions, each Marine doing their best to keep their head down while they took shots at anything that moved. The Zorathians were relentless, but there were moments where they slipped up, and that was all Harris needed to strike back. Each successful ambush was a small victory in a battle that seemed entirely lost, but as long as they fought there was hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind them all of one thing: humanity might be outmatched, but they were not easily defeated, and as long as Sergeant Harris breathed, he wasn't going to let them forget that. Harris woke to the sensation of being weightless, his mind foggy, as the familiar hum of battle faded into a distant memory. When his eyes fluttered open, he found himself in an unfamiliar place. The walls were smooth and metallic, the air smelled sterile, the kind of sterile that made you want to gag. His wrists were bound to a chair, and his head ached like a drumbeat in his skull. He tried to move, but a sharp jolt of pain reminded him that he was restrained. He wasn't on Earth anymore, he realized with a cold shiver. The Zorathians had him, they'd taken him, and he didn't know if they planned to kill him or use him as a tool to get what they wanted. What he did know was that he had to stay sharp, no matter what they were going to try and break him. They always did. The enemy never understood the mind of a Marine. They thought they could intimidate or manipulate, but they never took into account the one thing that made humans dangerous: their sheer refusal to give up. A door opened with a soft hiss, and a tall Zorathian entered the room, its elongated figure almost glowing under the harsh lights. Its eyes seemed to pierce right through him as it looked down its face, a mix of scorn and curiosity. "You are Sergeant Harris," it said in a language that was guttural, but somehow clear to his ears. "We have taken you because we believe you know something that can help us destroy your species." Harris didn't respond, he just stared at the alien's face and waited for it to continue. "We have destroyed your military and your cities," the Zorathian said almost smugly. "There is nothing left of your forces, yet you resist with such passion." It stepped closer, its voice lowering to something more threatening. "Tell us why you fight knowing that your species is on the brink of extinction." Harris grinned despite the pain. The alien's words didn't get to him. They never did. He had heard this kind of talk from enemies before, thinking that a few broken cities and fallen soldiers meant the end of humanity. But they were wrong. The fight wasn't just about weapons or tactics. It was about something more, something the Zorathians would never understand. "We fight because we don't quit," Harris said, his voice rough but steady. "We fight because that's what we do. When you push us to the edge, we push back harder than you ever thought possible." The Zorathian's eyes narrowed, studying him as if trying to figure out if he was just boasting or if there was some truth to the defiance in his words. "You have no chance of winning," the alien said, its voice cold. "Your planet will fall, and your people will be crushed under our might." Harris let out a short laugh, even as his mind raced, looking for any way out of this situation. He couldn't give them any information. He couldn't break, not now, not when there was still hope for Earth. "You're wrong," Harris said, his tone hardening. "You think you know us, but you have no idea what humans are capable of." He leaned forward, straining against his restraints. "You might have all the firepower in the universe, but you'll never understand why we fight, and that's your biggest mistake." The Zorathian stood silent for a moment, its expression unreadable. Then it straightened up and gestured to the door. Two more aliens entered the room. "We will see if you are as tough as you claim, Marine," the alien said coldly. "Perhaps we need to teach you the cost of resistance." They dragged him out of the room and into a long, dark corridor. Harris didn't struggle. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what they were trying to do. But the truth was they weren't going to break him, and they weren't going to win, not as long as he still had breath in his lungs. They could have all the power in the universe, but they would never have what humanity had inside its heart, and that was something no alien force could ever take away. The Zorathians threw Harris into a small cold room. It was dimly lit with a single bowl hanging overhead, and the air smelled of metal and chemicals. They hadn't bothered to lock the door behind him, which told Harris one thing: they weren't worried about him escaping. They were worried about breaking him. They wanted him to crack. They wanted him to beg or to plead for mercy, but that wasn't going to happen. He sat on the floor, his wrists still bound, and thought about what had happened to his squad. His unit had been scattered in the chaos after his capture. He didn't know if they were still alive or if they'd been overrun by the alien forces, but he couldn't afford to think about that now. His mind had to stay focused on surviving and figuring out how to turn this around somehow. Time passed slowly in that room. It felt like hours or maybe days, the silence pressing in on him until it was deafening. Finally, the door opened again, and the same Zorathian who had spoken to him earlier walked in. This time, it wasn't alone. There were two others with it, both towering figures with weapons strapped to their sides. Harris didn't flinch as they stepped toward him. They could do whatever they wanted. They could torture him, but they couldn't break his spirit. The lead Zorathian spoke again, its voice cold and detached. "Sergeant Harris, we have been reviewing the data on your species and your history. It seems you have developed a curious concept, one that we do not understand, your so-called rules of war." It paused, as if trying to process the words it had just spoken. "You claim to follow a set of ethics even in times of conflict. We are curious to know how this works." Harris raised an eyebrow and leaned back against the wall. He had been expecting something like this. The Zorathians didn't understand the concept of morality. In war, they didn't care about the lives they trampled on. As long as they achieved their goals, they hadn't even realized they were committing atrocities. They had no idea what they had unleashed on Earth. "Well," Harris said with a chuckle, "you've heard of the Geneva Conventions, right?" He could see the blank looks on their faces. They had no idea what he was talking about, but he pressed on anyway. "It's a set of rules that guide how we humans fight wars. We don't target civilians, we don't use certain weapons, and we sure as hell don't go around torturing prisoners of war." The Zorathian officer tilted its head slightly, as if trying to comprehend the idea. "And why do you follow these rules?" it asked. "What makes you believe these ethics make sense in a war?" Harris's grin widened. "Because we're not animals," he said simply. "Because we believe in something more than just winning at any cost. We fight with honor. We fight for something bigger than ourselves." He shook his head. "It's not about killing, it's about protecting what matters." The alien officer stared at him for a long moment, and Harris could almost feel the wheels turning in its head. It didn't understand, it didn't get it, and that was exactly why humanity had a chance, because the Zorathians had no idea how to fight a species that would rather die standing than win through dishonor. "Well," Harris said after a moment, "I guess you're going to learn the hard way what happens when you forget about all that." He could feel the tension building in the room. The Zorathians didn't know it yet, but they had already lost. They just didn't realize it yet. The officer stepped closer to him, its eyes narrowing. "You think you can teach us something," it sneered. "You're just a human, a weak, fragile creature that has no place in this universe." Harris met its gaze unwaveringly. "You can call us weak all you want, but we don't break," he said, "and that's what's going to cost you in the end." With that, he leaned back and waited as the Zorathians tried to make sense of the words. They still couldn't grasp what they were up against, but they would soon enough. Harris knew it, and they would learn just how dangerous humanity could be when it was pushed to the edge. The Zorathian officer stood there, its eyes narrowing, as if trying to digest Harris's words. But no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't grasp the concept of honor. It couldn't understand why humans fought the way they did. The aliens were built for conquest, for domination. They didn't see the value in standing by a set of rules in the middle of a war. To them, strength was the only thing that mattered, and the idea of a moral compass was as foreign as a concept could be. Harris sat back in the corner of the room, staring at the floor, not expecting an immediate response. He knew that for the Zorathians, this conversation wasn't over. It was just the beginning. They couldn't understand how humanity worked, because they had never faced a species that fought for something beyond victory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer spoke again, its voice tinged with something like frustration. "You cling to fight with honor to protect something, but it is clear to us that your species is weak," it sneered. "You cannot win this war. You are already losing." Harris's eyes narrowed. He wasn't going to let them get to him. He knew exactly what they were trying to do. They wanted to break him, to make him see that humanity was doomed, that it was pointless to resist. But Harris wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. He didn't care what they thought of humanity. He cared about what he knew deep in his gut. "You don't get it," Harris said quietly, but with conviction. "It's not about winning, it's about fighting for something bigger than us, something that doesn't just live and die with a single battle." He stood up slowly, his muscles sore from being bound for so long. But he didn't care. He was a Marine, and Marines never back down. "You can wipe out our cities, you can burn our homes, but you'll never take our will to fight, never." The officer's expression flickered with what might have been doubt or confusion, but then it quickly masked it with a haughty sneer. "You are delusional." It said, "This war will end and your species will be forgotten." It motioned to the other aliens standing nearby, who seemed to be waiting for something, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Harris took a deep breath. He knew what was coming next, and he wasn't afraid. They were going to try and torture him. They would use every tool they had to force him into submission, but they weren't going to succeed, because no matter how much they hurt him, no matter what they did to him, they couldn't take away his belief in humanity. Before the officer could give an order, one of the other Zorathians spoke up, its voice soft, but carrying a weight of authority. "What if he is right?" it asked. "What if we have underestimated their capacity to resist?" The room fell into silence. As the words hung in the air, the officer shot a look of irritation at the speaker. "You know nothing of human nature." It snapped, but there was a noticeable hesitation in its voice. "They are not worthy of mercy." "But what if their spirit is stronger than we imagined?" the other alien pressed. "What if their belief in their cause is more than just a weakness? It could be something we cannot defeat with brute force alone." The officer turned sharply to face the speaker, and for a moment Harris could see the crack in their confidence. The uncertainty creeping in the Zorathian leadership wasn't as unified as they had led him to believe. There were cracks, there were divisions, and that was something Harris could work with. "I think you'll find out soon enough." Harris said, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. "Because when you fight a species that refuses to quit, you've already lost the moment you underestimate them." The officer stepped back, visibly taken aback, but it quickly regained its composure and turned to leave the room without another word. The others followed suit, leaving Harris alone again. This time, he didn't feel defeated. He felt something else, a flicker of hope that the seeds of doubt had been planted inside the Zorathian ranks. And if he could keep pushing those cracks, if he could make them question their own actions, there was a chance humanity could turn this around. In that small, cold room, he realized something crucial. This war wasn't over, and the aliens hadn't won yet, not by a long shot. Harris was left alone in the dimly lit room for what felt like days, his body aching from the restraint, but his mind was sharper than ever. He knew that the Zorathians were beginning to crack. They were starting to doubt themselves, and that was his opening. Their confidence in their overwhelming power was fading. But he also knew that they still saw him as a mere human, just another weak soldier who would eventually break under their control. What they didn't understand was that the more they pressed him, the more they tried to break him, the harder he would fight back. Days passed in silence, and Harris could feel the tension building. He had no idea what the Zorathians were planning, but he could sense they were getting ready to do something drastic. Maybe they would try to execute him, or maybe they would bring him into a higher council to show him the true extent of their power. But Harris was ready for whatever came next. His resolve was unshakable. One day the door opened again, but this time it wasn't just one officer or a few soldiers. It was a group of them, at least 10 Zorathians, all wearing armor and carrying weapons. Harris stood up, his back straight. Even though his hands were still bound, he wasn't going to show weakness in front of them. They wanted to break him, but he wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. The officer who had interrogated him before stepped forward, its eyes narrowed with something that could almost be called suspicion. "Sergeant Harris, we have reconsidered your situation," the alien said, its voice cold and clinical. "It seems your species has more tenacity than we first anticipated." Harris didn't say anything. He just stared back, meeting the officer's gaze with a steady calmness. He didn't need to say anything because he knew what was coming next. "We will offer you a choice," the officer continued. "If you cooperate fully and tell us everything about your military tactics and defenses, we will spare your life and allow you to live among us as a prisoner. But if you continue to resist, we will make an example of you. We will show your species the cost of defying the Zorathian Empire." Harris felt a small surge of triumph. The alien was trying to appeal to him with threats. It thought it could intimidate him with its power, but it was making a mistake. It was assuming he had something to lose. "You don't get it, do you?" Harris said, his voice steady. "I'm not here to make a deal with you. I'm not here to beg for mercy, because I don't need your mercy. I don't need anything from you." He paused for a moment, his eyes hardening. "What you're offering means nothing to me, because I fight for something you'll never understand, and that's why you'll never win." The officer's eyes flashed with anger, but it quickly regained its composure. "You still think your species has a chance?" it spat. "You are a dying breed. Your planet will fall, and we will crush your resistance, no matter how hard you fight." Harris didn't flinch. He just smiled, a small, almost grim smile. "You've already lost," he said quietly. "The moment you started underestimating us, you lost." He leaned in closer to the officer, his voice low but filled with confidence. "Because you can destroy our cities, you can kill our people, but you'll never kill our spirit, and that's something you can't fight with all the weapons in the galaxy." The officer stood silent for a moment, as if processing his words. Then it motioned for the others to step back. "Take him to the interrogation chamber," it ordered, its voice cold. "We will see how long your spirit lasts when faced with true power." As they dragged him away, Harris didn't resist. He didn't need to. He knew the Zorathians still didn't understand what they were up against, but they would soon enough. Every day he spent in their hands was another chance to show them that humanity wasn't just a species that fought back. It was a species that fought with purpose and honor, and no matter how much they tried to break him or crush the resistance, humanity's will would never be extinguished. The Zorathians dragged Harris through the winding corridors of their ship, his feet barely touching the ground as they pulled him along. His mind was racing with possibilities. He knew they would try to break him, but he had been through worse. There had been times when things seemed impossible, when it felt like all hope was lost. But he had always found a way out, and he would find a way out of this too. They threw him into a cold, dark chamber. The walls were lined with strange technology and alien equipment. Harris didn't know what it all did, but he wasn't interested in that. He was focused on one thing: getting out of here and sending a message to his people to let them know that they weren't alone, that humanity wasn't finished. The door hissed closed behind him, and for a moment there was silence. Then the lights flickered on, revealing several Zorathian soldiers standing in front of him, their weapons raised. But they didn't move closer. They just watched him, as if waiting for him to make the first move. Harris didn't give them the satisfaction. He stood there with his hands still bound behind his back, his posture straight, and his eyes locked on theirs. He didn't care how many of them there were. He wasn't afraid of them, because he knew that fear was exactly what they wanted, and he wasn't about to give it to them. The officer from before stepped forward again, its eyes hard and cold. "Sergeant Harris, you have proven to be more resilient than we anticipated," it said, its voice like ice. "But you will break eventually. No one can withstand this kind of pressure for long." Harris's lips curled into a smile. "I've been under pressure before," he said quietly, "and I'm still standing." The officer's eyes narrowed with frustration. "You think your resistance means something," it sneered, "that it will change the outcome of this war." It took a step closer, its voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You are nothing more than a fleeting moment in time, a speck of dust in the grand scheme of the universe." Harris's smile didn't fade. "Then you don't know humans very well," he said, "because we've been the underdog before, and we've won every time. You think you've got us cornered, but you're wrong. You have no idea what you're dealing with." The officer stood silent for a moment, clearly unsure how to respond. It clearly didn't know how to process the kind of resolve Harris was showing, because it was unlike anything they had ever seen before in a prisoner. But Harris knew that this was just the beginning. They would keep pushing him, they would keep trying to break him, but he was ready for it. He wasn't going to give them what they wanted. He wouldn't break. "We've learned something interesting about your species," the officer said, finally breaking the silence. "You don't fear death, you don't fear torture, you only fear losing everything you've ever known: your home, your people, your way of life." It paused, as if savoring the moment. "So we will take that from you, Sergeant Harris. We will take it all and leave you with nothing but the realization that your species was powerless to stop us." Harris's heart pounded in his chest. But it wasn't fear, it was something else, something more primal. It was anger, pure and simple anger at the idea that these aliens thought they could destroy everything his people had built, everything they had fought for. And yet he didn't feel defeated. He felt something else, something stronger. "You're wrong," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "We're not afraid of losing everything, because we fight for something bigger than ourselves. We fight for each other, for our families, for our future. And as long as we still have that, we can never be defeated." The officer's eyes flickered for a moment, and for the first time Harris saw a glimmer of doubt there, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold resolve. "You will see soon enough just how powerless you are," it said, and then motioned for the others to begin the interrogation. But as they moved toward him, Harris didn't flinch. He didn't fight back. He didn't need to, because he knew that no matter how much they hurt him, no matter what they did, they could never take away the one thing that had made humanity strong, the thing that had kept them alive through every war, every disaster, every trial they had faced. They could never take away their spirit. And that was something the Zorathians would never understand. The Zorathians began their interrogation with brutal efficiency. Their methods were cold, calculated, designed to break the will of anyone who faced them. But Harris didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he focused on the thing that had kept him going through countless battles, the thing that had kept him alive when every part of him wanted to quit. The one thing the Zorathians could never understand: the power of human resolve. Hours turned into days, and the pain never stopped. But Harris didn't allow himself to break. He refused to let them see his weakness. He had been through worse, Before the wars, the losses, the battles where he thought there was no way out, but he always found a way through, and he would find a way out of this too. The Zorathians tried every trick in the book. They used every method they had to extract information to make him give up his secrets. But no matter what they did, he didn't speak. He didn't give them what they wanted. And that frustrated them more than anything else. It made them question their own tactics, made them wonder if maybe they had underestimated this species more than they realized. One of the Zorathian officers who had been overseeing the interrogation grew impatient and slammed his fist against the table, his voice booming in the silence. "Why won't you break?" he snarled. "You're just a human. You're nothing compared to us. You should be begging for mercy by now." Harris lifted his head and met the officer's gaze without fear. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice rough from the abuse, but still steady. "You think you can break me, but you've already lost because you don't understand what we fight for. You don't understand why we keep going when everything tells us to stop." The officer glared at him with unrelenting hate, but Harris didn't back down. He knew what the Zorathians didn't understand, the thing that made humanity dangerous. It wasn't their weapons or their technology. It was their belief that no matter how bad things got, no matter how many times they were knocked down, they would always get back up. They would always fight for their home, for their families, for each other. "You talk of fighting for something," the officer sneered. "But what will it matter when your planet is in ruins, when your species is wiped out?" He paused as if savoring the thought. "We will make an example of you. We will show your people the price of defiance." Harris chuckled weakly. "You're wasting your time," he said. "You've already made your biggest mistake. You've underestimated us, and that's something you'll regret." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The moment you decided to invade Earth, you lost the war, because you never understood what makes us strong." The officer's eyes flickered with something like doubt, but he quickly suppressed it, his hand shaking with anger, as he raised his weapon toward Harris. "Enough of your resistance. You will break, or you will die here," he growled. But Harris just smiled again. "That's the thing," he said, his tone growing stronger despite the pain. "You don't get to decide when we break. We do, and we're not breaking today." In that moment, the officer seemed to hesitate. Something in his mind shifted. The confidence he had been carrying seemed to falter just for a second before it was gone, and the harsh anger returned. But it was different now. There was something else, their doubt, a crack in their perfect control. Harris had seen it, and he knew that it was just the beginning, because once doubt took hold, it couldn't be easily shaken off. The officer turned and motioned for the guards to leave the room, and for the first time since his capture, Harris was left alone again, the room silent save for the sound of his own breathing. He sat in the stillness, not knowing what would happen next, but for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to feel something other than pain, something that had been buried deep inside him, hope. Because he knew that the Zorathians weren't invincible, and he wasn't alone. There were still others out there, still fighting, still resisting, and as long as they kept pushing back, Earth's spirit could never be crushed. The silence in the room stretched on longer than Harris expected, the weight of it pressing in on him as he sat there, bruised and broken, but not defeated. His mind raced through every possible scenario, trying to figure out what the Zorathians were planning next. They had been trying to break him for days, but they had underestimated something that they could never understand: the power of hope, the power of resilience, the power of a species that refused to quit no matter the odds. The door to the room hissed open, and Harris looked up, expecting the usual group of soldiers or interrogators. But this time it was different. A new figure stepped through the threshold, an officer whose armor was more ornate than the others. This one didn't look like it was there to torture him or demand information. It looked almost regal, its posture stiff and commanding, its eyes scanning him with cold calculation. "Sergeant Harris," the officer said, its voice calm, but laced with authority. "I've been observing you for some time now, and I must admit I find your persistence fascinating." It took a step closer, and Harris didn't flinch. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear or doubt. He would stand tall to the end. "You are not like the others," the officer continued, its gaze studying him carefully. "Your will is formidable. It makes me wonder if there is something more to your species than we realize." It paused as if considering its next words. Tell me what drives you. Why do you resist so fiercely when the outcome is so clear?" Harris straightened his back despite the pain coursing through his body and met the officer's gaze head-on. "Because we don't quit," he said, his voice steady. "You think you've won because you've taken our cities and killed our soldiers, but you've only made us stronger. You've only made our will more unbreakable." He shook his head, slightly as if the officer was missing the point. "You can't win because you've never understood what we're fighting for. It's not about power. It's not about destruction. It's about protecting what matters, the people we love, the things we've built, the freedom we cherish." The officer studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, Harris saw something that resembled a flicker of hesitation in its eyes, as if the words were weighing on it somehow. "You fight for your people," it said quietly, almost to itself, as if trying to comprehend the idea. "But how long will that resolve last when you are faced with annihilation?" Harris's smile was faint but resolute. "It lasts forever," he said softly. "As long as we're alive, we'll fight to the last breath. Because that's what it means to be human. We don't give up, and we never forget what we're fighting for." The officer's eyes narrowed, but it didn't respond immediately. Instead, it motioned for the guards to release Harris from his restraints. To his surprise, they obeyed, and the heavy shackles fell away from his wrists. The officer stepped back and regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and cold calculation. "You are a strange species, Sergeant Harris," it said, its tone still impassive. "You've shown us something we did not expect." It paused, then spoke again with a certain finality. "Perhaps your species does have something worth preserving." Harris stood there in silence, his body still aching, but his spirit unbroken. The officer's words were unexpected, but they didn't mean anything yet. Action spoke louder than words, and Harris knew the Zorathians hadn't abandoned their goal of total conquest. Not yet, but the crack in their confidence had widened, and Harris was determined to exploit it every way he could. Before the officer turned to leave, it paused at the door. "We will see where your resolve takes you, Sergeant Harris," it said. "But know this, no matter what happens next, humanity's fate will be sealed by what you choose to do now." Harris watched the officer disappear into the hallway, his mind already working on the next step. He didn't know if he would escape, or if he would be able to rally enough resistance to turn the tide of the war. But one thing was certain: as long as he had breath in his lungs and hope in his heart, he would never stop fighting for Earth and for everything that made humanity worth saving. As the door closed behind him, Harris sat back down and closed his eyes for a moment to gather his strength. He had no illusions about the road ahead, but he knew that no matter how dark things seemed, no matter how outnumbered or outgunned humanity might be, there was one thing the Zorathians could never take from them: their will to fight, and as long as that remained, no victory could ever truly belong to their enemies.